Start right at the beginning, and the beginning is who I am, what shapes me, what informs me, and why I became a campaigner. And I can't start without talking about my father. So my father came to this country in the late 1950s in search of work. He came here invited by UK government back then, when there was clearly a shortage of workers here in Britain, and he went to Derby and worked, found a job, etc. Worked in a foundry all his life. My mother joined him later on. The women came later. He was Indian, Sikh, didn't speak a word of English when he arrived here, but he saw England as the land of opportunity for his children and for a future. So I'm one of 7 sisters and I have one brother, and we all went to school in Britain, in Derby. And I watched almost, 43 years ago now, I'd say, the majority of my sisters being taken out of the classroom at the age of 15 years old to marry men they'd only ever met in photographs. They would disappear one by one, and no one ever questioned where they had gone. And, you know, they'd gone off to marry this stranger. And in fact, my sister Rabina, who's in this picture on the right, she missed 9 months of her education. She's 2 years older than me. She was returned back to school. And when she came back, there was a 9-month absence that nobody ever questioned. She was also now somebody's wife. Her appearance changed completely. These are all indicators, by the way, because she was no longer allowed to wear a Western dress. And she also had a wedding ring on her finger. And to top it all, she was put back into my class at school because she'd missed so much of her education. So, you know, the issue of children and young people is at the heart of the issue that I'm talking about today in terms of child marriage. And that's how we have to think about this, forced marriages, and the concept you may have heard, honour abuse, and I'll talk more about that. So when it was my turn, I came home from school at the age of 14 years old. My mother sat me down and she presented me with a photograph of a man that I was to learn I was promised to from the age of 8. So there's me, the 8-year-old. And by that time, I'd already been promised into a marriage. And please understand that, you know, when we think about engagements, promises of marriage, these are safeguarding issues. If you're hearing about somebody who's been engaged at the age of 10 or from birth they've been promised to somebody in marriage. Now, we know first cousin marriage is practiced in this country predominantly by Muslim communities. So when you see a first cousin marriage, the propensity to ensure that marriage goes through is always stronger. Therefore, the safeguarding to that young child is going to be even higher. So when you hear that, you mustn't think, oh, it's tradition, you know, it's what they do, it's part of their culture. Because when you're thinking like that, you're actually aligning yourself to a mindset of a perpetrator that is using that to pull the wool over your eyes. In fact, when you hear that, what one has to do is consider this is not right, there's a child engaged, therefore that child is likely to get married. Now, I say that because for me, when I was that 14-year-old challenging my mother, and there's another pertinent point to make here, and that is that in this space, and I'm ashamed to say this as a woman, women are perpetrators. In fact, the majority of victims who are calling the national helpline at Carmen Havana are citing their mothers as perpetrators. And when we look at murders nationally, we know the convictions are aligned themselves to mothers also. So you mustn't overlook mothers. And I know in the safeguarding space, you will be considering the family as a protective factor. Well, in this space, I can tell you they are not. So when you are thinking about honour abuse, forced marriage, child marriage, even FGM, female genital mutilation, you need to think about immediate family as perpetrators, and that person is not safe in that family dynamic. And when you are thinking about fostering or putting that child into extended family members, that's not safe either. And if anybody wants to look more into that and give the example of that, please look at the case called the BM Children. I was expert witness in that case, and there were 3 children who had risk to life. Whenever they were being placed in a Muslim foster placement, they're all Muslim, the risk to them increased. The family tracked them down. In the end, the social worker said these children are not safe within a Muslim culturally appropriate placement, I suppose you would call it. So the decision was made to put them with white foster carers, and the risk to those children completely disappeared. And sometimes you're going to have to make those decisions because of reasons of safety. So I said to my mother, I'm not marrying this man. And I remember looking at this photograph and thinking, he's shorter than me, he's older than me, and I just don't want to bleep marry a stranger, is what I was thinking in my head. And I dared to say no. And what we have to remember is that none of my sisters ever challenged my mother, ever. So here was my mother for the first time being challenged by her daughter. And I say that to you because what you have to remember in this space is that these young people have been conditioned to understand this is acceptable. There is brainwashing going on here. This is conditioning. This is coercive and controlling behaviour, if you put it into that context. So for a 14-year-old to say to you, you don't know what you're talking about, you don't know my culture, I'm getting married, that's what we do in our family, and they're trying to convince you it's normal, is because for them it's been normalised. And that is something that as a professional you will have to take time to undo, to talk to them about. And what they really want you to do is to safeguard them in this space, to take them out of this so that they do not have to be the bad guy, I would say. So, you know, in that family dynamic, and I've dealt with thousands of children, young people that have said, I just want to be safe, you know, but take the onus off me. So I can say to my mother and my father, it's not me saying this, it's them, because that's your duty. So my mother was very clear that I would not dishonour this family by saying no. I was allowed to go to school until the age of 15 and a half, and I protested more so. And you will understand what an honour system is as I talk about this throughout my presentation. But adolescence, you know, as a teenager, you are expressing your sexuality, your personality, you want to go out with your mates, etc. All that, it can be deemed as shameful behaviour, as dishonourable. So that the risk to the person increases because the family see this person as not conforming, and that was me. Okay, so my parents took me out of education and they held me a prisoner in my own home. Now, what I mean by prisoner in my own home is that I was locked in a room with a padlock on the outside of the door. That was their way of punishing me for saying no to this marriage. And I have to say, I became invisible to the school system, to a safeguarding system that didn't ask where I was. But in the context of this space, who would they have asked? They would have asked the parents. That's who they would have asked. And what parents will do in this space is give you all the things you want to hear, give Oscar-winning performances, and you need to not believe that. In policing, there's a term that I heard years ago, it never left me, and it's ABC. And in this place, you need to use ABC, accept nothing, believe nothing, challenge everything, because your victim has multiple perpetrators, and it happens to be the people who are meant to love them the most, their nearest and dearest. So in that room, I attempted to take my life. I took an overdose. And I remember my sisters walking me up and down, plying me with black coffee and saying, if you think that's going to change anything, you're wrong. So I was not allowed medical attention. And the desperation was immense. It's no surprise to me that South Asian British-born females in this country, aged 16 to 24 years old, have a suicide and self-harm rate which is 3 to 4 times higher than the national average. We're dying a lot faster compared to our white counterparts, and it has everything to do with what I'm talking about. So in the end, I agreed to the marriage, which allowed me to plan my escape. And if you think your wedding day is meant to be one of the happiest days of your life, and here I was, you know, almost feeling like I had a bird's eye view looking down on all these wedding preparations that were taking place around me for a wedding that happened to be mine. I ran away from home at the age of 16 to make the point that I was born in Britain. I should have the right to an education, and I certainly should have the right to marry, if indeed I do want to marry somebody in my life in the future. I ran away to Newcastle up north because even then, as a 16-year-old, I thought it's all the way up there, they'll never find me up there. You know, I was in Derby at the time. My parents reported me missing to Derbyshire Police, and here was a police officer you know, almost 40 years ago, who was faced with this teenager, because I was tracked down. And I have to say that this police officer saved my life. It could have been any professional on that day. It happened to be a police officer. Why did he save my life? Because the first thing he did was he believed me. That's the first thing he did. Okay, he didn't treat me as a stroppy little teenager who'd fallen out with her family and could somehow mediate her way out of this. Let's take you back. Let's talk to your mum and dad. You know, teenagers fall out with their parents. He actually believed that I could be being forced into a marriage. And that, for me, significantly put me at ease straight away. Because here is a family within the context of a number of people, all denying that I'm being forced into a marriage, and mum, dad, sisters, brothers, and trying to convince an authority that we're not doing this. Because let me be very clear, I accept you need to ask the question, are you forcing your child into a marriage? You'll always get the same answer, no. Nobody is going to admit to forcing anybody into a marriage, okay? But then the police officer did say you do need to ring home and tell your family that you are safe and well. And I accepted that. So back then, I was in one of those red telephone boxes that we used to have, and, you know, desperate to hear my mother say, come back, you know, you've made your point, everything's fine now, come back. Because I was missing my family. You know, in the context of family in that space, I was safe, I was warm, I was raised with my brother and sisters, and, you know, played as young people, went to school. So, you know, it was home. And to this day, I recall the conversation, and I've probably repeated it thousands of times as a campaigner wanting to break the silences, because it's so important to hear how a family responds to a victim of honour abuse and forced marriage, a victim who is challenging a system that seeks to oppress individuals, to remove them of rights and independence. So my mother answered the phone, and I said it was me, and I want to come home, but I won't marry that man. I'm only just 16. And my mother was very clear. She said, I either come back and marry who they say, or from this day forward, I am now dead in their eyes. She was more vitriolic than that, and went on to call me names and to say, I hope you give birth to a daughter who does to you what you have done to me, then you will know what it feels like to raise a prostitute. You've shamed us, you've dishonoured us. You know, if you don't come home and marry who we say, then it's over. So as a 16-year-old, I'm faced with that choice in my life. I can have everything that you all take for granted every single day, independence, rights, freedom, and to be safe, but it means not having my family. Or I can have everything I've ever known, and that's my family, but it means marrying a stranger, conforming to an honour system that seeks to abuse you as a female, and marry a stranger. And I chose not to go back, and that significantly changed my life forever. So my family disowned me. I won't go into the reconciliations and trying and whatever. If anybody hasn't read my book, Shame, please do. I'm not plugging it for that reason, because it's about awareness. That's what this is about. And my family refused to acknowledge me, my children, and they haven't spoken to me for 42 years now. Do I regret my decision? No, I don't, and I'll tell you why later. So Rubina's on the right hand side there. Sometimes when you're disowned by your family, you do have secret relationships with family members, and she was one of them. And my sister suffered a horrific marriage. And within the space of domestic abuse, when you're suffering abuse and you go to a family that gives more precedence to honour, and you as a woman have to ensure that you uphold the honour of the family. So the honour of the family is invested in the things you do, you don't do, your sexuality, etc. When Rubina would go to my family and say, I'm being abused, she'd show them the bruises, etc., they would encourage her to go back to the abuser for the sake of honour. So this is a pattern you see within this dynamic. And this is where you will hear victims talking about the shame and the dishonour. If I leave my husband, if I say no, if I take your choices to keep me safe, and there's this turmoil going on. And my sister actually was sent to see a community leader. Community leaders have a lot of power and influence in these communities. They can be political leaders, religious leaders, councillors, politicians, people with good standing in professions, even those in your profession. And families will take note. Families will look at them and say, please talk to our child and help them to see sense. But more importantly, families will take note of what they say. So if they're in this sense, for Rubina, who saw a councillor, a political councillor, who became the first Indian Lord Mayor actually of Derby, if he'd have said, leave your husband, your family will protect you, my parents would have been happy with that decision, but he didn't. He said, you need to go back to your abuser and you need to ensure that you make this marriage work, because to leave this marriage would be dishonourable and shameful to your family. Within the space of a few days, my sister went back, and tragically, my sister committed suicide. She set herself on fire. She suffered over 80% burns and she died. And I remember hearing about this from a stranger, because when you're disowned, you don't hear about births, deaths or anything in your family. In fact, last year on Facebook, I heard that my brother had died, and that's how you get news, if indeed you ever get news. And I remember hearing this news and saying to my mother, ringing her and saying, I want to come home, you know, Rubina's dead, I want to come back home. And my mother was very clear, even though she lost the daughter in such a horrific way, you will not show your face, you must not come here. This changes nothing. It was better for my sister to take her life than for her to dishonour her family and divorce her husband. Now, this is the mentality that I'm speaking to right now. And just to say, when you are looking at a family or a victim in a family, you don't look at one victim. You need to look at the family dynamic. You need to consider the other children in that family. And I say that because when I ran away from home, I was promised to this man at the age of 8. Because that promise of marriage wasn't made through me, my younger sister was forced to marry him. So remember that other siblings will not be safe by virtue of the fact that you now have information that this family operates a mentality where they force their children into a marriage. So this is not just about one child, this is about all the children. And I will talk about that in a little while. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So it was Rubina's death that actually led to me founding the charity that is Karma Nirvana. And for me, the fact that her death meant nothing to my family, and I was told not to come to her funeral, not to show my face, it was a turning point in my life, because as a victim, when you leave your family, you're constantly in a space of wanting your family's acceptance. You want them to love you. You want them to not reject you, and you're constantly going backwards and forwards in that space and in turmoil. So her death actually made me learn to accept the decision. You cannot make somebody love you in whatever context in your life. You know, this is about their views and beliefs and mine being the total opposite. And I have to accept that. Doesn't make it right, but that's what I have to accept. So Karma Nirvana was founded in my front room in 1993. I hope you've all heard of Karma Nirvana. So back in 1993, the helpline started in my front room. You know, we had no calls 93 to 97, but for me, I always believe victims are out there. We were just not hearing them. And that will be the same for you across your area. You know, think about who your communities are. You know, this is not just happening in South Asian communities. This will be happening in Afghan, Kurdish, Iranian, Polish, dual heritage children, African. It will be affecting a number of communities. You know who your communities are. And incidentally, the helpline has statistics that breaks down by area how many calls have come to the helpline. So if any of you are interested in how many calls the helpline is receiving from your area, please contact Karma Nirvana and they will keep you informed of that quarterly. So to go from no calls to a helpline, I campaigned for the helpline to become a national helpline, campaigning to government. That helpline is now funded by Home Office. I always say government don't give us anything, you know, we have to work hard for that. and make the case. So now that helpline from 2008 became a national helpline, has received over 150,000 contacts, and currently the helpline receives 900 calls per month. The really important thing I want to say to you is this: please remember that helpline is a resource for you. As a professional, 42% of the calls to that helpline are professional callers. They are health visitors, social workers, teachers, police officers. What the helpline is saying is, if you feel that you suspect a case like this, or if you're dealing with a case like this, or if you've got a victim that you want to support, you don't know how to, if you are confused about the cultural issues and the safeguarding issues, there's a helpline there to call. You don't even need to say who you are. Pick up the phone. These people are trained in risk assessment in this particular field, and they're there for you. So please use it. And if you want helpline posters, contact Common of Honour, they'll send them to you. So one of the things that I campaigned for 10 years was a criminal offence of forced marriage and the forced marriage unit. So the forced marriage unit is, again, a resource for you. It's really important to note these resources because I acknowledge I don't expect you to be an expert. However, this is a safeguarding issue, and the more support you have, the more you are going to be able to frame this in the safeguarding space. Okay, so you've got a national helpline. I'm saying you're not on your own is what I'm saying. You've got the government's forced marriage unit. Go to the website and look at their unit. They've got resources for you. We have statutory guidelines for multi-agencies that are free and there for you. Order a copy and it will tell you the do's, the don'ts, what to do, how to risk assess in this space. They've been around for years. The forced marriage unit predominantly deal with repatriations of British citizens that have been taken out of this country forced into marriages. So they're rescuing them and bringing them back. A third of their cases are children under the age of 17 years old, as young as 5 years old. So if you are concerned about somebody abroad, again, the forced marriage unit can help you. So the campaign for criminalising forced marriage became law in 2013. I'll talk about that in a little while. So now we have a criminal offence of forced marriage. So you can frame this as a crime and not something that is cultural. And also the National Day of Remembrance I'll talk about is July the 14th, and this is an opportunity for you to raise national awareness about honour abuse. Common of Honour marked 25 years in 2018. I put that on there because I left as the CEO in 2018. After 25 years, I thought it was time to go. First of all, it's not healthy for a founder to stick around for too long, but more importantly, I have 3 children and my children always say, no, mum, you have 4, the 4th is Common of Honour. The point I'm making is that it consumes you, you know, it's a passion, is it not? And you're driven by it. So it was time for me to go. The charity is going very strong and I'm pleased to say that. So next slide, please. So that's the Common of Honour timeline. I'm going to do definitions now with you in terms of what constitutes an arranged marriage and a forced marriage. This is a government definition, okay, the forced marriage unit's definition. The first thing I'm going to say about the tradition of an arranged marriage is that you must not use this definition if the person is under 16 years old. If the person is under 16 years old and you're hearing about marriages and engagements, it is abuse. It is a safeguarding issue. So to use this definition, the person has to be 16 and have full mental capacity. So they have to have the capacity to give informed consent. So an arranged marriage happens across many communities. You know, they've been happening for centuries. It's a tradition of communities. An arranged marriage is where it's normally a family takes a leading role, but the parties have the free will and choice to say yes or no. All right, so it's about consent. This is not rocket science. So by virtue of the fact, if it's about consent, a forced marriage is the opposite. It's where the consent has been removed, where mum and dad are saying, you're saying no, but you haven't got a choice. You're still going to marry. So this is where families will use duress. This is where the forcing is happening. It's up to you to hear about what that forcing is. It could be physical abuse. It could be taking them out of school. It could be home educating them. It could be taking them out of the country. But most victims talk about psychological abuse. That's what they talk about. Grandma will die of a heart attack, it will be your fault. You're doing this to your family. How can you do this? You're shaming them. And many people victims talk about how this impacts on them more. Now, in cases where people have learning disabilities, they cannot give informed consent. It's an automatic forced marriage. And the legislation in terms of the criminal offence is written like that. And I really pushed for that. So if there's no consent, it's an automatic, they're breaking the law, basically. The grey area is a bit that the government haven't put in there, and I put that in there. So this is where you have somebody saying, yeah, I do, mum, dad, I want you to find me a suitable partner, etc. And there comes a point and they change their mind. So they say, but I'll go through with it for the sake of my family. Now, is that forced or is that arranged? That is forced, because there's been an element of duress and coercion. Currently, Carmen and Ivana are campaigning for a change in the law to increase the age of marriage from 16 to 18, and it's happening. We're getting a lot of support for it. In this country, you can marry at the age of 16 with parental consent. However, in these cases, what we understand about that is that that consent can be coerced, and that's what we're saying. For the law needs to change. It needs to be increased to 18 for all. I mean, it's a nonsense that at 16 you can get married with parental consent, but you cannot buy nail glue, for example, at the age of 16. You know, you cannot buy an alcoholic drink at the age of 16, but you can get married. So the law, we hope, is going to change. If anybody wants to see more about that campaign, please go to the website and support it. Next slide, please. So in the context of all of this, what is underpinning this? Now, what are the motivations for a family to be behaving like this? It is an honour-based system. So whenever I'm risk assessing a case, I will always use this definition. My objective is to, as an expert witness in these cases, especially around children, most of my cases are with child cases, is to assess whether the family operates an honour system. And if it does, what does that look like in terms of risk? So this is a national definition used by all of our 43 police forces. Honour-based abuse, I would say to you, please look at this definition whenever you're risk assessing the cases, and the definition I've given you of forced and arranged marriage. It's an incident or crime which has or may have been committed to protect or defend the honour of the family and or communities. So NPCC, I always forget what that stands for. It's the National Police Chief Constables, I think it is, stands for that. The reason why may has been highlighted in red is because what this definition is asking you to do as a practitioner is to risk assess what a victim is telling you in terms of their perception of what may happen in the same way you would actual evidence. Because in this space, many victims will talk about, and who knows best? A victim knows best, don't they? In any sort of abuse, in any sort of crime, their experience and what it could happen to them is the one that we have to hold with true value. Okay, so on the Carmen Ivana helpline, they get calls day in and day out where they've got a victim saying, my brother's seen something in my mobile phone, it's from a mate, but it happens to be a boy. He's not a boyfriend, just a mate, and now something's going to happen to me. Somebody's seen something on Facebook, and I'm with all my mates. I'm not allowed to talk to white people. We hear this, but I'm with white friends, and now they think I'm shaming the family. Something may happen to me. The point I'm making is the perception of what they are reporting has to be dealt with exactly the same way. You need to think in this space that if a victim is saying that could happen, it's likely to happen. And I'll give you an example of a case, a horrific case of where that did happen. You can distinguish with some of the forms of abuse. So if you think about the domestic abuse definition, incidentally, we now have a Domestic Abuse Act that for the first time places children and young people as victims in their own right, not as witnesses to domestic abuse. They are now victims in their own right. So you need to be thinking in the space of a victim being risk assessed in their own right in this space. So in this context, our victims have, or the victims of forced marriage, honour abuse, I call them our victims, have multiple perpetrators. But more importantly, where we see a victim, you know, a victim of forced marriage, what a family will see is not a victim, but somebody who's going against the system, they'll see a perpetrator. So what they will do is they have what we call a meeting of minds. Sit down, mum, dad, family, call uncle, whoever, and let's have a conversation about how we're going to deal with her or him for not conforming. And this is where you see approval, collusion going on from family and community members. You know, let's call the community leader in as well and have a conversation. So where we see murders, these are premeditated murders. People have sat down and thought about how they're going to deal with our victims. So that meeting of minds is happening within a family dynamic. And please remember, those multiple perpetrators are not only across your region, they can be in different parts of the UK, they can be abroad. And if you have the absence of somebody's just disappeared, and you hear, well, they've gone to live with auntie in, I don't know, Slough, Leicester, then that needs to be followed through with that authority, because that's how family behave in these cases. They'll start moving our person around. And honour-based abuse, you might just have honour-based abuse, but not forced marriage. Okay, so if you're not seeing forced marriage, don't think, oh, it's okay, there's not a forced marriage. It could be honour abuse. Okay, but then what families do is sometimes when they have that meeting in minds, because that person isn't conforming, it can become a trigger for a forced marriage. So families will say, for example, she's not conforming, he's not conforming. And please remember, men are also affected in this space. The majority of the calls from men to the National Helpline and to the government's forced marriage unit are gay men who are forced into marriages to hide their sexuality. That's what families do. So they will say, he's not conforming, you know, he's still gay, you know, it's a shameful, etc. So we'll marry him off. So being gay was the shameful factor, it was dishonourable. Dealing with him, get him married. So please remember that is happening in terms of using forced marriage to deal with honour abuse, shameful behaviours. Next slide, please. So I did say that in terms to highlight May, I was going to give you a case. So this is the case of Banaz Mahmood. If anything highlights it, this is the one that should highlight it in terms of how you have to risk assess the perception of what could happen in exactly the same way you would actual evidence. So Banaz was Kurdish, and she had a number of siblings. She was forced to marry at the age of 16. She was almost beaten to death in that marriage and repeatedly raped. Did report to West Midlands Police. She lived in Birmingham, and people were not dealing with it as an issue of honour abuse. So Banaz in the marriage wasn't living up to the expectations of her husband, who felt it was shameful. For example, shameful to not be available for sex whenever he wanted. You know, that's dishonourable, because as a female, you should be doing whatever your man tells you to do. You are perceived as property in the context of this space. So she was pushing against all this, and in the end, Banaz did leave her husband, and her family allowed her to come home. Note I say allowed her to come home, because if any of you had a child that was being abused, certainly with me, I would want to take them into my home and protect them, keep them safe. But in this space, Banaz did go to her family many times. They sent her back, as with my sister Rabina. But because she was nearly beaten to death at one occasion, they allowed her to come home. So Banaz now is living in East London. She has a secret boyfriend, so that's an indicator, a secret boyfriend. Why? Because she knows if the family find out she has a boyfriend, that's going to be deemed as being shameful and dishonourable. So one day she meets her boyfriend outside an East London tube station. They're chatting and she says goodbye to him and she kisses him goodbye. A member of her community, so not even a member of her family, a member of her community witnesses this, and I am going to say witness because this is now an incident. This is now a shameful act. So she sees this person seeing this, and now she believes she's at risk. This is going to go back to the family. The community is a faster intelligence system, trust me, than a policing system. So she's now fearful for her life, thinking they're going to find out I've got a boyfriend, I've kissed him, something's going to happen to me. So she goes to a random front desk police station in East London. I want you to imagine her coming to you. You decide in your own minds how you would respond. So she says this: I have been seen kissing my boyfriend outside a police station by a member of my community, and for that I'm going to be killed. You decide in your head what you would be thinking. How would you be feeling as a practitioner? How would you be thinking about responding? And then she says, they're going to kill me. My family are going to kill me for being seen kissing my secret boyfriend. Something's going to happen to me. She repeats it, repeats it, and repeats it. So a practitioner hearing this, I accept that you are going to be challenged. You are going to be thinking a number of things. And what the officer responds with is, don't be silly. You're not going to be killed for being seen kissing your boyfriend. That's not going to happen. So she was dealt with as being melodramatic, overreacting, and not taken seriously. But I hope now that you're hearing me in terms of the definitions, etc., you would know that in the context of honour abuse, what she's reporting as her perception is likely to happen. So she left. Banaz went to a number of police stations after that time, over a period of time, because her family went quiet. They didn't do anything, actually. Now, when families go quiet, that doesn't mean nothing's going to happen. They're probably biding their time. So she was told the same thing by officers. On the last occasion, she handed an officer a sheet of paper and she said, if I go missing, these are the people that would have killed me. That's what she said. On the top was her father, her uncle, and other male members of the family. Sure enough, Banaz did go missing. Her family never reported her missing, and that's an indicator. Think, why wouldn't you report your child missing if your child is missing for a long period of time? So basically, her boyfriend reported her missing. So he reported her missing. He pushed and pushed and pushed. Now, if you know anything about missing persons, if you're a young person and you're missing and you've got history from running away from home, you are not a priority. But he banged on the door and he said, something has happened. She went to the station. They've seen us. They know that we're a couple. Somebody's done something to her in her family. And thankfully, his persistence landed on the desk of a detective inspector called Caroline Good, who was trained in these issues. So she looked at this completely differently. I always say with regards to victims, on the day you get a professional, whether you're going to be protected or not, depends on the knowledge of the individual. This is why I say, please use the helplines, get more information about the subject matter in order to be informed, to risk assess effectively and to be supporting that risk assessment. To cut a long story short, Caroline considered the family members as perpetrators. She looked at this from an honor-based abuse perspective. She listened to the boyfriend and what he was saying in this space. That led to the body of Banaz Mahmood. Banaz Mahmood had been repeatedly raped, garroted, murdered, put in a suitcase and buried in a house in Birmingham. And the people that were convicted were all the people that were named on her sheet of paper that she presented to the police that she believed were likely to kill her. Thankfully, they were all prosecuted. The tragedy also is that in the end, her boyfriend tragically committed suicide. He was put into witness protection and he couldn't cope and he died. So there are many victims in this space. So believe the victim is the message I put there. Next slide, please. I'm looking at the clock and thinking I haven't got a lot of time, but I'm going to keep on going as fast as I can. Next slide, please. I'm going to start ad-libbing now. So I always talk about the case of Shafilia Ahmed. It's a very well documented case. Shafilia was British, Pakistani, lived in Warrington, in an area where there were not significant minorities. And I say that to you because please don't minority community in your area, you haven't got a problem. In fact, the opposite is true because those victims will be more isolated because of that attitude. So she was one of 5 siblings, normal teenager, went to school. But what was happening with Shafilia, and her reporting started at the age of 13 years old, excuse me, her reporting started at the age of 11 years old, and it was reporting to school. It was reporting to health and social care. And then the reporting was to the police. And what she was reporting time and time again is, I'm being abused by my parents because they won't let me wear makeup. They won't let me have a mobile phone. They've told me I'm not allowed to integrate. I'm not allowed to even look at boys, let alone talk to boys. They don't like what I wear. I'm too westernized. So You can clearly see what's happening with Shafila is this is honour abuse. And the way her parents are dealing with her is by beating her. On one occasion when she was 15, she went to housing. She begged them to place her in housing, showed them bruises and said, I'm being abused by my family because I'm just doing normal things as teenagers do. And one would hold me down and the other one would beat me. That's what she reported. But every time at every juncture in her journey, what practitioners did was, let's talk to your family. Now, in any other scenario, tell me, where you have a victim, do you actually ever sit them down with a perpetrator and have a conversation? I don't believe you do. But in the context of this space, practitioners, if you think of the family as a protective factor, you are putting our victim with those individuals. So, of course, Shafila in that space, and she was at those meetings in school, in social care, etc., said, I just want more freedom, you know, and said less about her experience, because the victim will never speak to you in the presence of a family member, not candidly, not openly, okay, because of the fear of the repercussion when they go home and the front door closes. So Shafilia's reporting continued and continued until she was 16 years old. Her reporting changed from honour abuse to I'm being forced into a marriage. So this is where you can see honour abuse. The family have made a decision. She's not conforming, so we're going to marry her off. So family are called in again to school. Family assure the school, we're not forcing our daughter into a marriage. You know, we wouldn't do that. And they believe, not her. And they said, but we do think she needs a holiday. So if you're hearing that, this to me is she's going to be taken out of the country. There is a risk here. We have to keep her in this country. To cut a very long story short, Shafila was taken home after that, and she basically was drugged in this country, taken out of the country by her parents. When she got there and she came around herself, they told her for her shameful behaviour of what has been a normal adolescent teenage kid, she will have to marry a stranger. To prevent that marriage, Shafila swallows half a bottle of what's deemed as toxic substance, and it was bleach. So the family have no choice but to bring her back to Britain. So now she's in accident and emergency in Warrington. She's on a hospital ward for a number of weeks. But two things happen. One, her family never leave her bedside. So to the health professionals, what loving parents, they don't leave her bedside. But actually what they're doing is keeping an eye on her. She mustn't tell anybody in that hospital what happened in Pakistan, and she doesn't. And secondly, she's going to come back to the house with them. She's not going to go into protective factor within a safeguarding system, and she ends up going back home. And it was shortly after that that she disappeared. Shafila, bless her, was laid on her living room floor by her mother and father. One sat on her legs, the other one shoved a carrier bag down her throat and suffocated her to death. All the siblings were told to watch, because if they behaved as dishonorably as her, being a normal teenage kid, this is what would happen. In court, Shafila's poetry was read out. This is one of several poems she used to write from the age of 13 in her bedroom. Shafila was an A-star student at school. She wanted to be a lawyer. That was her ambition. And in that poetry, this one read out, my stomach is burning, all they think about honour. I was a normal teenage kid, didn't ask too much, I just wanted to fit in. My culture was different, but my family ignored me. Not only did her family ignore her, 4 statutory organisations ignored her too, in terms of not understanding this space. Next slide, please. Her parents were finally convicted, and we campaigned long and hard for that conviction. They pleaded not guilty. They still professed their innocence. They got 25 years with no parole. They're her parents there. Next slide, please. I'm going to whiz now. Sentencing remarks in some of it by Justice Roderick Evans. You know, here's mum and dad in the dock saying, and he says to them, you wanted your family to live in Pakistan, in Warrington. Yeah, it's no different for me. You wanted your family to live in India, in Derby. Although she went to local schools, she objected to socialising with girls from what was referred to, by the way, all the time throughout this trial as the white community. She was being squeezed between 2 cultures. Remember, the only place sometimes our victims have for any thoughts of freedom and independence is going to be in school, college, university, wherever, out there. The life at home is the stronger one. When the front door closes, this is where they are suffocated. This is where you have coercive and controlling behaviours, and that is the stronger of the two. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to bring up this particular case here, Sandy Fernandez, because Sandy is an Indian Sikh girl, and I came across her case because her friends wrote to me and they said to me, we want to tell you about Sandy. We want you to raise awareness about Sandy. And she was disowned by her family at the age of 17 because she didn't agree to a marriage. They threw all her belongings out into the street. Sandy started from scratch like me. She became a psychiatric nurse. She had a very successful career, vivacious, lively, her family, her friends, but referred to her as, but the issue was she couldn't cope with the rejection and constantly tried to attempt reconciliation, as I have over the years, as somebody disowned by a family. She suffered from depression and anxiety. The reason I say this to you is because your victims, when they leave, will have these feelings. That's when they need the emotional support. That's when I would be calling the Calm Nirvana helpline and getting them to talk to a survivor. Tragically, she committed suicide when she was 30 years old. Her parents took her body. The friends heard about where this funeral was and they attended, and they said that at the funeral they were not allowed to sit with this family. They had to be on the other side. So they did their own memorial service in the end, which is how they found me. And they said their family said her soul would never be at peace because she sinned by taking her life. And you think, you know, in this space, the point I'm making to you is this: victims of forced marriage, non-abuse, you know, the indicators of withdrawing from education, not having ambition, may not be the case. You know, some of these victims are bright, articulate, etc., but there are real challenges in this space. So please remember this, the ABC rule that I mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. Incidentally, her brother tells me off for showing that slide, but that's another story. How can they break honour then? Okay, this list is not exhaustive, but please remember that by saying no to a marriage arrangement is dishonourable. Integrating can be dishonourable. Having relationships outside of marriage, you be in the wrong sexuality, divorcing. Please remember in this space what we're seeing more and more is obviously, you know, social networking, mobile phones, and revenge porn is becoming an issue, where we're hearing victims call the helpline saying, you know, I went out with somebody and now he is using images of me and threatening me with my family. He's going to show them unless I sleep with other boys, unless I give him £1,000 or whatever. So the concept of honour is being used in this way. Changing religion. If you are supporting somebody and you've put them into foster placement or they've moved, please ensure that the Find My Friend is taken off their phone, because families will be looking to track them all the time. Even when they're living at home, they'll be doing that. Appearing to westernize. One of the biggest ways we can dishonour a family is to seek help. Speaking to you. One of the biggest fears a victim will have always when they start to disclose things to you is, you're going to tell a member of my family. That's their biggest fear. Now, I accept in this space, especially with children, you will be engaging with families, but please think about what you're sharing with families. If you are going to share something that is perceived as dishonourable, you have just put your person at risk. So please seek advice on that from the Calm Nirvana helpline. Next slide, please. So if that's how you can break honour, how can I regain honour? How can I become more respectable to my family? Well, the first thing I can do is agree to the marriage. You know, I'm gay, but, you know, I'll just get married. Forget about my sexuality. I'll just get married and live a life like that. Or I'm not gay and I'm still going to agree to the marriage because it'll make my family accept me. So I can do that. I can comply with family honour codes, but more importantly, I can enforce them on other people. You know, I can become this brother, the gatekeeper of the family, or even a daughter that starts ensuring all my siblings behave according to an honour system. I can reprimand people for perceived to have been dishonourable. You know, in the extreme, I can kill that person. You know, we do know cases where siblings do take it upon themselves to deal with their sister or murder them, and I can disown them. So in some families, I'm not going to get into a debate of wearing a headscarf here, but please remember that the perception of becoming more religious wearing a headscarf can be an honourable thing. So if you have somebody whose appearance has completely changed, they never used to wear a headscarf, they never used to wear traditional dress, like my sister Rabina coming back from India, she was not allowed to wear a Western dress again. Think of that as why. Why has that changed? And read into that and ask questions. Next slide, please. Whizzing through this. So the victim's experiences. The controllers of honour-based abuse are always within the family. Please remember they include women. The honour of the family is invested in the reputation of my decision making, what I do, what I don't do. I will be watched and controlled regardless if there's an honour system in the family. But if I seek help, that watching is going to increase. That includes by my siblings in school, etc. Honour does create internal conflict. When I seek your help to safeguard me, I'm going against my family. I'm feeling guilty. Can I do this to my family? And this is where the conflict starts, and the internal conflict, and you start feeling suicidal, there's self-harming, etc. And the biggest fear is linked to confidentiality. You're going to tell a member of my family. I've already talked about suicide. Next slide, please. Gosh, I've got 10 minutes. Potential perpetrators. Think about the family history here. You know, I hope you do a genogram in these cases and you think about mum and dad. Were they married at first cousins? So if they were married at first cousins, it's highly likely that's going to be carried on with their children. Well, have there been early marriages in the family? Are there any suicides in the family? The more you find out about the family, the more you are going to be informed and enlightened about your victim right in front of you. Remember, witness intimidation and collusion is very high. So if you're protecting a person, family members will be seeking to pressure them to keep you out of their life. And loyalty to service or community, I say that because I know there have been breaches of confidentiality, breaches where you've got a serving police officer or a serving safeguarding social worker, let's say, from the same community. Families will lean on them. Are they going to share that information with them? Well, we have seen that in these cases. Next slide. So forced marriage protection orders, I hope you've all heard of these. So this is a specific injunction designed to protect somebody who's at risk of a forced marriage or who has been into a forced into a marriage. You can apply for these, and it's really important that you consider these. Every case is unique. Carmen Nirvana is identified as an organisation that can also apply for these, so if you need help, do. In the context of you as practitioners, your local authority legal department should be dealing with these, but police can also deal with these. So my point is, if you have a victim where you think they're going to be forced into a marriage, because you can apply for these protection orders on the grounds of perception. So if you think somebody's being forced into a marriage, you can apply for an order. So the point I'm making is the threshold for providing the evidence in these cases is the bar is not high, it's very low. So say you have somebody that you are concerned about their whereabouts. You know, we've not seen, I don't know, Jasvinder for 6 to 8 weeks now. We're worried. The family are not telling us where they are. You can apply for an order to reveal the whereabouts of that person. Now, if this order had been put in place for Shafelia, they couldn't have taken her out of the country. If this order had been put in place when I left home for my younger sister wouldn't have been forced into marriage. The point I'm making is, so if you're looking after the 15-year-old, she's at risk of forced marriage, I strongly advise you to name all the other siblings in that family on the same order, because what you are looking at is a family that has a propensity to force their children into a marriage. Not just one, all the others will become at risk as well. Even if it's a 1-year-old, you put them on that order. These are not time limited, and it enables these conditions to be put on there. Next slide, please. So one of the things about forced marriage protection order is that what you're going to find is some victims may wish to retract. Once an order is put in place, it's the only specific injunction I know in this country where we are returning victims back to multiple perpetrators. It is not fait accompli because we have an order in place, now everything is fine. No, you're going to get victims being pressured, albeit a judge may have named mum, dad, auntie, uncle, whoever. You mustn't pressure this person. You can take one look. They can have somebody else outside the family pressuring our person. And this is where you're going to get victims saying, everything's fine now, I don't want that order in place, and they'll want to retract them. If that is the case, you need to look closer, please. We have to ascertain true wishes and feelings. Carmen Nirvana do statistics where, do statements where they can provide them for you by if you want them to, meet with the person to ascertain true wishes and feelings, because what you are trying to identify is this person, this victim who you've been protecting, is now saying everything's fine. Is this a genuine part of the protected person's wishes and feelings, or is this the family pressuring them? Okay, so I would be looking for opinion in that case. And the majority of forced marriage protection orders, according to the Ministry of Justice, are being issued to protect, in their thousands, children. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go into the law, but there is a criminal offence of forced marriage. This has been around since 2014. Sadly, we've only had 3 prosecutions, actually, so not 2 since 2014, 3. It is an absolute scandal, as far as I'm concerned, that we have thousands of people reporting this crime and yet so few prosecutions. And incidentally, in the 2 prosecutions, I was the expert witness in the 13-year-old case in Birmingham. Notice there were 13, 15. That 13-year-old was taken abroad to marry a stranger 10 years older than her. She was raped by that man. Remember, if you're forced into marriage, you're going to be raped on your wedding night. She became pregnant. Her mother took her to a GP. Her mother convinced the GP she'd been sleeping around and needed an abortion. So again, these are cases pertaining to children. And in both of those cases, incidentally, both victims gave evidence against their family. So it is a myth to say that victims do not want to prosecute their family. Victims just want to be safe. That's what they want to be. So I've talked about the criminal offence, but also in this space, please remember the legislation controlling coercive behaviour is also relevant, because if you look at that legislation, I used to think to myself, still do, this has been written for honour-based abuse, because within that legislation, it talks about how coercive and controlling behaviour is a purposeful pattern of behaviour to exert power, control or coercion. That is an honour-based system. It's designed to have a substantial and adverse effect on the victim's day-to-day activities. So start using the language of this sort of legislation and to get people to sit up and acknowledge this. Next slide, please. There are many, I've only got 2 slides left. So there are many victims, and if you look at all this picture here, these are many of the victims that have lost their lives to honour abuse and forced marriage. And tragically, in all these cases, the people that murdered them were the people that were meant to protect them the most, family and extended family members. So I just want to go back to when I was 16 years old to share my experience. I said to you, you know, when I was left home, did I regret my decision? I don't regret my decision at all. I stand by it completely. And the reason why is because one of the things you don't know, any 16-year-old doesn't know, is when you're making life choices, and for me it was a life choice, leaving my family, you are actually creating a new path for the future in terms of future generations. So my children, I didn't know that on that day I was making that decision for them, but I know that now. But one of the things I used to say to my daughter Natasha, who is the eldest, when she was 13, I used to say, and this, bear with me as a parent, this was my fear. I used to say, whatever you do, Natasha, when you do decide to get married, don't go out with an Indian boy. And I hope you're smiling at this point, people, because I can't see your lovely faces. And she would say, Mum, you can't say that to me, Mum, that's racist. Now, I said that because of my own, I suppose, fears as a mother, but my own prejudices, because every single one of us is shaped and informed by our experiences in life. And we do prejudge situations in order to be safe and to feel safe. And with my daughter in marriage, when I think about marriage, I was lending on my own personal experience. So if she decided to marry an Indian boy, you don't marry a boy, you marry a family. That family is going to look at your mum and your dad. Your dad's side is fine, but what about your mum's side? She ran away from home at 16. She's been divorced twice. She married out of caste, and she's a stroppy campaigner to boot. So my fear was they would take that out on her. That was my fear. So Natasha goes off to university and she meets this guy. Next slide, please. Who, I have to say, highlights the fact that whenever you ask your children to do something, they're always going to do the opposite. So she meets this young man here who is now my son-in-law, Anup. And I'm sharing this story with you because nobody is doing this in the name of culture, okay? Cultural acceptance does not mean accepting the unacceptable. You know, this story enables me to remind you of this, but it also enabled me to embrace my own wonderful things about my history, my heritage, and my culture. So when I met Anup, he was, to my shame again, guilty until proven innocent. And as I heard his story, I'd never met a family like his family. So his grandfather came to Britain in the late 1950s, like my father. And the difference is his grandfather went to Leeds, my father went to Derby. His grandfather raised his children in Yorkshire, in Leeds, to be educated, to have the right to choose who they want to marry, you know, to be Leeds United supporters. They speak with Yorkshire accents. Loving, protective family. I'd never experienced that in my family, and yet we have the same background. I know not every family is doing this from my background, but I'd never experienced it. So his father actually had an arranged marriage when he was 20 years old, and his mother came from India, and they have a very loving, happy marriage. So with Anup, they said to him, you know, when you decide to marry, if indeed you do, because he went to university in Leeds, that's how he met my daughter. They said, you know, we don't care who you marry, you know, she can be black, white, pink, whatever, you know, as long as she's a Leeds United supporter, we're absolutely happy with who you want to marry. And I'd never experienced that before. So he met my daughter, who was fully embraced within the family, albeit she's a Derby County supporter, I hasten to add. And they had the big fat Indian wedding. Now, on that day, almost 8 years ago, you know, we had 300 guests. So if any of you know anything about Indian weddings, they go on for days. Not one member of my family was at that wedding. And yet here I was thrown into my own wonderful traditions and culture within my family dynamic. And, you know, even though not one member of my family was there, I know she had that day because of the decision her mother made when she was 16. In making my decision, in you giving the right practitioner response and safeguarding these individuals, you are creating future generations. I've broken that legacy of abuse that my children will never ever have to inherit. But we are reliant upon you in safeguarding us in this space so that we have a chance with a future. Because remember, we have been brainwashed to believe this abuse is normal. So our hope is in you. So cultural acceptance does not mean accepting the unacceptable. I want you to take away from this conference, more than anything, that saying, this is abuse, and that is what it is. So my next slide, when I think about my children, it's a total blank on grandma's side. Grandma has no family. These are my grandchildren. I have three grandsons. This is a new generation, you know, new legacies. You know, what do they have as children? You know, they don't have family on grandma's side, but they have love, unconditional love and regard, independence. Your responses can shift a generation, and that is my plea to you. Next slide, please. And this is the last slide, and I totally apologize for going off the screen at the time that I did. This is you're not on your own. These are useful contacts. Please remember, in this space, nobody expects you to be an expert. We do expect you to safeguard this. We do expect you to use your duty to frame this as a safeguarding issue. That's the Carmen of Honour website. That's the helpline number. That's the Government Forced Marriage Unit number. That's my website. And that's also my email. Thank you so much for listening to me. I do apologise for the blip, but I thank you for your patience.